The Baron's son loved a Lakota Maid, and the tribe called it justice. The Baron's son stood at the edge of the prairie road, where the Lakota camp had once rested. The ground still marked by the faint circles of fire pits and wagon tracks pressed into the earth. And though the wind moved gently across the grass, nothing in him felt calm. Because the woman he loved had been taken from this place by force disguised as law. She had been a Lakota maid working at the Baron's estate, quiet, observant, and careful not to draw attention to herself. Yet kindness had a way of revealing people no matter how softly they walked. And it was that kindness that had drawn the Baron's son toward her long before he understood the cost. Now she was gone, seized by territorial officers under the excuse of tribal order. Dragged away at dawn while the Baron's house still slept, her wrists bound not by rope but by authority that refused to see her as human. The son had been locked inside the estate that morning, ordered by his father to remain silent and obedient, told that interference would bring ruin to their name. Yet the sound of her voice calling once, only once, had cut through him deeper than any blade. When he reached the road hours later, all that remained was a single moccasin half buried in dust, and the knowledge that she had been taken toward a settlement known for judgment without mercy. Riders passed him without slowing, some avoiding his eyes, others wearing the smug satisfaction of men who believed power excused cruelty. And with every passing moment, the son felt the truth settle heavier in his chest. His father's wealth had built walls that protected cruelty while silencing justice. He mounted his horse at last, not knowing where the road would end, only knowing that staying would make him complicit in what had been done. Behind him, the Baron's estate stood tall and untroubled, its windows reflecting the morning light as if nothing had been taken from its halls. But ahead lay Lakota land, uncertain and watched, where he would be seen not as a master's heir, but as a stranger carrying guilt he had not yet learned how to bear. As he rode, memories pressed against him. The way she had lowered her eyes when spoken to harshly, the way she had stood straight when treated with dignity, and the quiet strength that had made him realize justice was not written in ledgers or titles, but in how one protected those without power. By the time the sun climbed higher, the Baron's son understood that the injustice was not only what had been done to her, but what he had allowed by staying silent too long, and that abandonment, once chosen, demanded to be answered with action, even if it meant losing everything his name had ever given him. By the second night, the Baron's son reached the outer edge of Lakota land, slowing his horse when he saw the first signs of watchful presence. The careful placement of stones, the quiet tracks that told of riders who moved without announcing themselves. And he dismounted before he was asked to, choosing humility over entitlement as he waited with his reins loose in his hands. He did not wait long, for two Lakota scouts emerged from the tall grass with calm authority, their expressions unreadable as they studied the stranger who carried himself not like a threat, but like a man already weighed down by regret. The son spoke plainly, naming the woman who had been taken, admitting his father's household had failed her, and asking not for forgiveness, but for permission to speak with those who might know where she was being held. The scouts exchanged a look that carried more meaning than words, then signaled for him to follow at a walking pace, testing not his speed but his patience. As they moved through the rolling land, the son noticed how carefully the camp was arranged. Fires spaced for warmth rather than display, horses tended with quiet respect, children kept close to elders. And the contrast to his father's estate tightened something in his chest, for here order served people, not pride. At the central fire, the Lakota chief listened without interruption as the sun told what had happened at dawn. How authority had been used to seize her, how silence had been demanded of him, and how he had chosen to ride anyway. The chief's eyes did not harden, nor did they soften, but remained steady as stones shaped by time. And when the sun finished, the chief asked a single question: whether the young man sought to take the woman away from her people or to stand with her, if standing proved costly. The son answered honestly that he did not yet know how to belong, only that he would not abandon her again. The chief turned his gaze to the fire, considering the weight of that promise, then spoke of the officers who had taken her toward a settlement that confused order with cruelty, saying witnesses had already been sent and that judgment would not be hurried. The son felt the ache of waiting press against him, yet he accepted it, realizing that rescue born of impatience often harmed the very people it claimed to save. As the night deepened, the chief allowed him a place near the fire, not as a guest, not as an ally, but as a witness. And in that quiet role, the Baron's son began to understand that justice here was not loud or rushed, but deliberate, communal, and rooted in the dignity of those it protected. The rescue came not at dawn, but in the muted gray before it, when the camp stirred with purpose, and the Baron's son felt the weight of movement pass through the Lakota riders like a shared breath. And he followed as instructed without question, keeping his pace measured as they rode toward the settlement where the woman had been taken. They reached the edge of the place, just as the sky began to lighten, finding her held in a small timber outbuilding behind the constable's office, guarded by two men who mistook their authority for safety. And when the chief lifted his hand, the riders spread silently, cutting off the lanes without a shout or threat. The son dismounted and waited, heart pounding, as the chief stepped forward and spoke to the guards with a calm that carried more force than anger, naming the woman, naming the unlawful taking, and naming the witnesses already sent to the territorial judge. Confusion rippled through the guards as they realized the ground beneath them was no longer solid. And in that pause, the door was opened from within, revealing the Lakota Maid, standing straight despite the long night, her wrists marked, but her gaze unbroken. The Baron's son met her eyes and felt the sharp relief of seeing her alive. Yet he did not move toward her until the chief nodded, because rescue here was not possession, but restoration. She stepped out into the open, the morning air lifting her hair as if the land itself recognized her return. And when one guard reached for her arm, the chief's voice stopped him, firm and final, declaring that no hand would touch her again. The son offered his coat without a word, draping it over her shoulders as she accepted it with a small, steady nod. And together they walked past the outbuilding, past the office, past the men who had believed titles could replace right. There was no chase, no blow struck, only the quiet authority of witnesses and the certainty that injustice collapses when exposed to daylight. As they rode back, the son kept his horse slightly behind hers, understanding that the rescue belonged to her first. And when they reached the camp, elders stepped forward to receive her with hands gentle and certain, confirming through touch and presence that she was home. Only then did the Baron's son exhale fully, realizing that the act he had imagined as a dramatic stand had been something far more exacting. A rescue built on restraint, truth, and the courage to let justice be seen. The camp received her not with questions or celebration, but with the steady rituals that restore breath to those who have been held too tightly by fear. And the Baron's son watched from a respectful distance as elders guided her toward a warm fire, offering water first, then food, then time. Because healing here moved at the pace of consent. A woven blanket was placed around her shoulders to replace the coat he had given, not as rejection, but as continuity. and she accepted it with a quiet gratitude that told him she understood the difference between shelter and possession. The chief spoke softly to the women, who would remain with her through the day, explaining only what was necessary, while the son tended the horses and stacked wood without being asked, grounding himself in work that asked nothing of her. When she finally approached the fire again, her face steadier now, she spoke to the chief in her own language, recounting the night without ornament. And the chief listened as one listens to truth, without interruption, without hurry. Then nodded, signaling that the telling itself was part of the safety being rebuilt. The Baron's son was invited closer then, not to speak, but to sit. And he felt the weight of that invitation settle on him, like a responsibility he intended to honor. The children returned to play, near the edges of the camp, their laughter careful at first and then freer, and the normal sounds of life. Pots set down, horses shifting, voices low, resumed, stitching the morning back together. The chief reminded the son that safety was not a gift taken once, but a condition maintained daily, and that if he wished to remain, he would do so under the same expectations as any other: respect, restraint, and patience. The son agreed without hesitation, aware that his presence must never become a burden to her recovery, and he kept his distance even as relief pressed hard against his chest. Later, as the sun climbed and warmth replaced the night's chill, she stepped into the light, breathing deeply, her posture straightening as if the land itself were lending her strength. And she met the Baron's son's eyes briefly, not with promise or gratitude, but with recognition. It was enough, because in that glance he understood that safe haven was not the absence of danger, but the presence of people who would stand between danger and the vulnerable, without demanding anything in return. And that the truest shelter he could offer now was to uphold that standard with his actions. Day after quiet day, as evening settled and the camp's work slowed into a thoughtful quiet, the Lakota Maid sat with the chief and the elder women, speaking in a low, steady voice about what she had endured and what she feared most now. Not the men who had taken her, but the way power could return wearing a different face if vigilance faded. The Baron's son listened from a short distance, invited closer only when the chief gestured, and when he spoke, he chose honesty over reassurance, admitting that love had come to him before courage, and that his delay had cost her safety, a truth he would carry without defense. She regarded him carefully, not searching for promises, but for steadiness, and asked whether he understood that justice among her people was not shaped by desire, but by responsibility. And he answered that he was learning the difference, that he would accept boundaries set by those who protected her, and that his place, if any, would be earned through conduct rather than words. The chief nodded at this, reminding them both that trust grows like a planted thing, watered by consistency and protected from haste, and he set clear expectations. The son would remain as a helper to the camp, accountable to its rules, while the woman would choose her own path without pressure or presumption. Over the next hours, small acts replaced speeches. The son repairing a torn lead rope, carrying water for the elders, stepping aside when asked. And the woman observed without comment, noting how he accepted correction without offense and waited without complaint. When the fire was banked for the night, she approached him once, asking a simple question about the road he had ridden and whether he intended to return to the estate that had failed her. And he answered that the road behind him no longer claimed him, but the road ahead would be taken only with consent. She considered this, then spoke of her own strength, of family ties and duties that would not be set aside for affection alone, and he received her words as instruction rather than refusal. By the time the stars sharpened overhead, A different bond had formed, not a union of romance, but a shared understanding shaped by accountability and respect, witnessed by a community that guarded its own. The Baron's son felt no urgency to claim a future, only the resolve to be present rightly in the present. And the Lakota Maid returned to her shelter with the quiet assurance that trust here would be measured by days kept honest, not by vows made too soon. The threat returned with the sound of hooves before it showed its shape, a hard, impatient rhythm that cut through the camp's evening calm and drew the attention of every watcher along the ridge. And the Baron's son felt the familiar tightening in his chest as riders appeared from the settlement road bearing the colors of territorial authority mixed with private interest. At their head rode the constable who had overseen the unlawful taking, flanked by men who carried papers and rifles with equal confidence, announcing that the woman must be returned for questioning and that the chief's intervention would be reported as obstruction. The chief stepped forward without haste, his posture upright and unyielding, asking the men to dismount and speak plainly. But they refused, choosing elevation and noise over reason, declaring that the Baron's name had been invoked and that compliance would be rewarded while resistance would be punished. The Lakota Maid remained still beside the elder women, her chin lifted, eyes steady, and the son moved to stand between her and the riders, only to be stopped by a quiet gesture from the chief, who reminded him that protection here was collective, not impulsive. Witnesses were named aloud: the elders, the scouts, the riders who had seen the seizure. And the chief stated that sworn statements had already been sent to the territorial judge, outlining the unlawful detention and the coercion used, a fact that unsettled the men more than any drawn weapon. One rider pushed forward, insisting that papers carried weight, and the chief answered that truth carried longer, then invited them to step down and hear the woman's account in daylight before witnesses. Anger flared, tempers rose, and the rifles shifted. But the camp did not, holding its line with the calm certainty of people defending a principle rather than a possession. The Baron's son felt the pull to speak, to leverage his name. Yet he remembered the rules set before him and held his silence, trusting the process that centered her voice rather than his status. The constable hesitated, measuring the cost of force against the certainty of scrutiny, and finally declared they would return with warrants, turning his horse sharply as the others followed, their threats trailing behind them like dust. As the sound faded, the camp exhaled together, and the chief reminded all present that danger often wears patience like a mask, returning when it believes resolve has softened. The Lakota Maid placed her hand over the woven blanket at her shoulders and met the chief's eyes, understanding that the days ahead would test not only their courage, but their commitment to justice carried through restraint. And the Baron's son understood that the true threat was not the men who had ridden away, but the endurance required to keep standing when power promised an easier path. That night, as the camp settled into a guarded quiet and the fires burned low, the Baron's son found himself awake, with thoughts that pressed harder than the cold. For the threat that had ridden away had left behind a question he could not ignore: whether his presence helped protect her or invited danger by reminding men of power that they were unwilling to relinquish. He walked the edge of the camp, careful not to disturb the sleepers, and weighed the cost of his name, knowing it could open doors or harden fists, and fearing that either outcome might pull attention back toward her when she deserved calm. Nearby, the Lakota Maid lay awake as well, listening to the familiar sounds of home layered with the unfamiliar memory of confinement, her thoughts circling, not around fear, but around agency, wondering whether safety built in response to injustice could remain hers to define. When they spoke, it was brief and measured, without expectation, and she told him plainly that protection must never become substitution, that no one would decide her path because danger existed, and that choosing herself was the justice she intended to keep. He received her words with humility, admitting that love had once tempted him to act quickly, to fix and claim, and that he was learning how restraint could be a stronger promise than any vow. The chief joined them, not to arbitrate, but to witness. And he spoke of justice as a long trail marked by choices made repeatedly under pressure, reminding the son that courage sometimes meant stepping back so others could stand forward, and reminding the woman that strength also included accepting support without surrendering authority. The son confessed his fear that remaining would draw the constable back with greater force, and the chief answered that fear could inform caution without dictating abandonment, setting a boundary that the camp would maintain its witness and its preparation while refusing to be rushed into reaction. The woman considered this, her gaze steady, and said she would not be moved by threats nor hurried by affection, that she would speak when called and stand where truth required, trusting her people to hold the line. The son felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly, understanding that his role was not to shield her with his body or his name, but to align his conduct with the justice the tribe practiced, patient, communal, and clear-eyed. As the stars wheeled overhead, the inner conflict settled into resolve. Not because the danger had passed, but because each of them had chosen a path that honored dignity over impulse. And in that choice, the night grew quieter, held together by the hard-earned discipline of waiting. Before dawn, the decision took shape not as a sudden act, but as a steady offering of responsibility. And the Baron's son asked the chief for permission to ride to the territorial seat with the sworn statements already prepared, knowing that placing his name and testimony beside the truth would draw attention he could not control. The chief studied him for a long moment, then agreed on the condition that the woman's voice would lead the account, his would follow only to confirm what power had attempted to conceal. A boundary the son accepted without argument. As the camp stirred, the Lakota Maid came forward of her own choosing, saying she would speak as well. Not to seek favor, but to place daylight where shadow had been used against her. And the chief assigned 2 elders and a scout to accompany them as witnesses. The ride was long and quiet, the son keeping pace behind the elders, resisting the urge to hurry, understanding that courage here meant patience under scrutiny rather than speed toward confrontation. At the courthouse, they stood before a clerk and then a judge, who listened as the woman spoke first, clearly and without embellishment, naming the unlawful taking, the confinement, and the pressure to comply, while the elders affirmed her words and the scout placed the timeline beyond dispute. Only then did the Baron's son speak, acknowledging his failure to intervene sooner, confirming the misuse of authority, and surrendering any protection his father's name might offer if it conflicted with the truth. The room shifted as papers were marked and questions asked. And when the constable was summoned to answer, his certainty faltered under the weight of a lying testimony that did not bend. The judge ordered a stay against further interference and set proceedings to examine the abuse of office, instructing that the woman would return under protection to her people without condition. As they left, the son felt the strange calm of having given up leverage in exchange for alignment, and the Lakota Maid walked beside the elders with her shoulders squared, not triumphant, but steady. The courage of the day did not roar. It endured, carrying the cost of exposure without demanding applause. And when they rode back toward the camp with the order in hand, the son understood that sacrifice had not been the risking of life, but the surrender of advantage so justice could stand on its own feet. When they returned to the camp with the court's order, the gathering was quiet but complete. elders and families forming a wide circle that made room for the truth to be received without spectacle. And the chief read the judgment aloud, so that no part of it belonged to rumor or privilege. The unlawful seizure was named for what it was. The authority that enabled it suspended pending inquiry. And the woman standing affirmed without condition, her words recorded and respected. The Lakota Maid stepped forward then, not to celebrate, but to acknowledge the community that had held the line while her voice led the way. And the chief responded by reminding all present that justice is not a favor granted, but a balance restored when the vulnerable are centered. The Baron's son stood where he had been asked to stand, slightly behind, accepting the shape of a union that was not romance or ownership, but shared responsibility. And when the elders addressed him, they did so plainly, stating that his conduct had aligned with their law because he surrendered advantage rather than wielded it. A brief rite followed, simple and solemn, marking the resolution of a wrong and the commitment to guard against its return. And the woman was invited to speak again, choosing to name her path as one of service to her people and openness to the future without haste. The chief declared that justice had been carried from witness to judgment without bloodshed, and that such a carrying bound those involved to continue acting with restraint. The Baron's son offered his labor to the camp for a season as restitution, not as penance, but as proof of continued alignment. And the elders accepted on terms that protected her autonomy and preserved communal oversight. As the circle loosened and daily life resumed, the sense of union settled. Not between two individuals alone, but among a people, a witness, and a standard upheld. The wrong that began with power had ended with accountability, and in that outcome, the tribe named justice not as victory over another, but as the right order restored, where dignity stood visible and the future could be approached without fear. In the weeks that followed, the land returned to its steady rhythms, not because the memory of what had happened faded, but because it had been set in its proper place, acknowledged and resolved without leaving a wound that demanded constant guarding. The Lakota Maid resumed her days among her people with a calm confidence that came from having her voice heard and believed, carrying herself not as someone rescued, but as someone restored. And when she passed through the camp, greetings followed her without pity or spectacle, only respect. The Baron's son kept his word, working where he was directed, mending fences, hauling water, learning the patience required to do things the way they had always been done, accepting correction without pride and instruction without complaint. And over time, his presence became ordinary rather than notable, which he understood as the truest measure of belonging. The chief watched these changes quietly, knowing that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the habit of choosing right order even when no one demanded it. And he reminded the camp that justice once named must be maintained by conduct, long after judgment was read. When the season turned and the grasses shifted color, the woman spoke with the elders about her future, choosing work that strengthened the community and leaving open the possibility of partnership only where equality was unquestioned. A choice the Baron's son accepted without condition, understanding that love worthy of justice never hurried consent. On a clear morning, the chief addressed them both, saying that the tribe would remember this time not for the wrong that began it, but for the way restraint, witness, and courage carried it to its end, and that such memory was a form of protection for generations who would walk these paths later. As the sun climbed and the camp dispersed to its tasks, the sense of purpose settled like a quiet promise over the land, shaped by dignity rather than force, and the Baron's son felt a future open before him that was neither inherited nor seized, but built through continued alignment with the values he'd learned to uphold. In that calm, Justice completed its work not by closing a door, but by making space for lives to move forward honestly. Justice stands strongest when it restores dignity rather than claims victory. Thank you for sharing this quiet path of courage and restraint with us. May every choice you make leave the ground steadier than you found it.